So I've been watching a lot of Bunny build guides lately, and despite her probably being the best covered Descendant in the entire game for reasons that are beyond my understanding, I don't think there's a single person out there who has built her correctly. Now, the reasoning for which is largely due in part to our inability to optimize for one build without having to worry about another. And I mean that, say we're building for Boss Bunny, even if we were trying to maximize her damage, we still had to worry about the M or the R or the X slot that we needed to keep in order to make our mobbing build work. And because of that, we had to make compromises in many places and use mods that we should never have. But with today's update, they have now granted us the ability to slot multiple mod polarities into a given mod slot. And because of this, we no longer have to compromise. We can fully build out our boss build and fully build out our mobbing and our farming builds. And because of that, I figure a lot of you are going to be revisiting all of your builds, namely Bunny, because she's obviously the Lord of Farming. And so today we're going to talk about Bunny and how you can optimize her for bossing, farming, or whatever scenario you'd like. Because as usual, we've built out a Bunny calculator. And it doesn't even have to be Ultimate Bunny. If you're a fucking weirdo who wants to blow all their catalysts on non-Ultimate Bunny for whatever reason, you can turn off high voltage and try to optimize your damage that way. But I will say that if you're trying to optimize regular Bunny without just getting Ultimate Bunny, you're kind of fucking dumb. In terms of builds, we're going to talk about the boss build first, and then we're going to talk about our dungeon build and then our farming build. Farming is different than dungeons, and I'll explain why here in a bit. But before we get into the builds themselves, we're going to talk about how Bunny works as a whole, because obviously we're going to be using high voltage for everything but the farming build, because high voltage is typically just the best approach to get the most damage out of Bunny. But Bunnies 1 and 3, or Q and V, both have a little snippet in their skill description that talks about how the damage will increase proportionally to the amount of electricity owned. And electricity is the little bar she has on the bottom. She builds it up whenever she's moving around. Certain skills can help her build that bar up faster, but that's not really the point, because maintaining the bar at 100% is really not that big of a deal. We are far more interested in what that bar does to her first and third abilities. The ability description says per 10% of electricity retained, it says skill power times plus 15%. Now that is very different from what you normally see, because if you look above where it's talking about the damage, it's saying skill power times 215%. But what does this plus mean? The plus means it's actually going to multiply it as an additional bucket. So separate from your power boost ratios, separate from your skill power modifiers, all that stuff. It does not add into the skill power modifier of the effect. It is an entirely separate multiplier, which means that technically, if you have 100% bar, you should be getting a 150% increase, which means a 2.5 times multiplier. All the damage you do from your 1 and your 3. It is already outrageously strong, but it is bugged. Right now, you cannot reach the 10th stack of the bonus. So while you're running around, you will at most get a 135% increase, because you'll always fall 15% short. So a 2.35 times multiplier. The current theory for this right now is that the threshold is not 10% per stack. Instead, it is 10.5%, because if you watch the numbers carefully as you're building up your bar, you will notice that it's around 95% of your bar that you get the 9th stack. And if the threshold were 10.5% of your bar for every stack, that would mean that 9 stacks is 94.5%, which would add up. So just something to be aware of as you're going around building your own stuff or looking at my math. Promise you I'm not insane, the bar is just bugged. Another important note is that the bar buff only applies to the direct damage applied from the abilities. The electrocution status effect that is applied to enemies does not benefit from the bar buff. And that's what we're going to talk about next, the electrocution. Because status effects in this game do not always work how they should. And a great way to show that is if we take Lepic. Lepic's overclock makes it so whenever you throw a grenade at someone or hit them with your ultimate, it applies a burn. And that burn's damage interval is once every second. And overclock reapplies the burn every time you throw another grenade or shoot another shot of your ultimate. Not clarified very well, and is rather unintuitive, is that some status effects can never ever do their damage if you continually refresh them. And the reason I brought up Lepic is because he's a perfect example for this. If I throw a grenade, let it tick, it'll start doing damage every second after the grenade hits and does its impact. But the burn has to accrue 1 full second after the grenade hits in order to do its first tick of damage. If I throw another grenade in between the second intervals, then it will reset the burn, and instead of the burn ticking half a second later like it should have, it has to wait another full second after the new grenade was thrown in order to deal its damage. And because of this, overclock doesn't actually do burn once your ultimate starts shooting faster than 1 shot per second, which is usually around the third or fourth attack, if I recall. But as soon as the ultimate is out of shots, and it can no longer refresh, then the burn will last for its duration. I bring this up just so you'll be aware of some of the quirks in this game. Bunny, when she is alone, does not refresh or kill her damage over time. However, if Bunny is with another bunny, then neither bunny will do any status damage, because each bunny will be continually reapplying their own version of the status effect to the target. And a great example is here with Obstructor. You can see that while I am going around him and I'm dealing my damage, my status effect will never take effect because it's never able to reach the 1 second after dealing damage because the other bunny is applying their status effect and mine gets removed. This particular logic doesn't apply to all status effects in the game. I'm really just bringing it up so that way you know that if you are in a group setting with more bunnies, you can pretty much just throw your damage over time out the window because the only damage you will actually do in that group setting is with the direct damage from your 3 or your 1. And then the last thing that needs explaining is how Bunny's speed of light works in conjunction with her V, or third ability, because her third ability will only deal damage after Bunny has traversed 7 meters. Now, if Bunny is just sprinting regularly with an 800 movement speed weapon, then that means she's going to deal damage every 0.9 seconds. Speed of light increases her move speed by 50%, which brings that 0.9 seconds down to 0.6. And that is a pretty fucking huge increase. There are different ways that you can take advantage of this movement, because it does count movement in all directions, X, Y, and Z. So you can use like grapple tech if you want, though I personally advise that you never do the grapple when you have enough mana up for speed of light. It's something that you would do before and after, but the best way is simply to use speed of light for that 50% speed increase. And that will bring us to the first two mods of our boss build, Maximize Conservation and Strong Mentality. This brings our skill cost reduction to a total of negative 50.6%. If you use the Slayer set, which we'll talk about later, it is instead a negative 35.6%. There's a lot of people that are going to try and tell you that Maximize Efficiency is better than Maximize Conservation because it cuts down on your max MP instead of your skill power modifier, but the skill power modifier loss from Maximize Conservation is only 20%, whereas the max MP loss from Maximize Efficiency is 25%. We're building into skill costs because we want to be able to run as long as possible, and taking away from our max MP, which would reduce our run time, is kind of counterintuitive. Maximize Efficiency is a genuinely god-awful mod. Do not slot it. Another alternative is that you could use the Narcissism Support Tech mod, and that will give you as much skill cost reduction as Maximize Conservation would, and you could use that in place of Strong Mentality. The only issue is, while it would give you a negative 33 skill cost bonus, it would also give you an added length to your cooldowns of 33%. So while the skill cost may be quite appealing, not being able to renew your 3 as soon as it finishes is kind of unappealing, and if you aren't able to renew your 3, then you've already lost shitloads of damage, and why are you playing Bunny to begin with? On to our next mods though, we do have the standard 4 crit mods. Just like Lepic, Bunny is a crit quadruped. If you aren't slotting the 4 crit mods, you're kind of fucking dumb. Dangerous Ambush is pretty much mandatory on every single boss build you will ever see in existence. And then for our attack and battle mods, we are going to go with Singular Specialist on our attack and Electric Specialist for battle. Electric Specialist will boost our electric skill power ratio, and Singular Specialist will boost our skill power modifier for singular based attacks. And since our 3 is a singular skill, that's all we really give a shit about. And then for our last mod, we will use Spear and Shield. This is just to boost our base skill power ratio in the same bucket with Slayer and pump our damage just a little bit higher. Our augment obviously needs to be high voltage. This increases the range of our 3 while also increasing its damage. The damage difference is not small. It is absolutely fucking massive. If you're trying to build around her third ability and you aren't using high voltage, you are trolling yourself. For your sub attack mod, I do recommend going with long distance maneuvering, just because if you do decide to go have a seizure with the grapple, you do want your grapple to have a longer range, so that way you can spin more. Now, is this build maximized to deal damage against bosses? Yes. Do I think it is a good build to use against bosses? No. It is wildly entertaining to be able to kill Devourer with your third skill without guns by just running around him in circles. But if you go into something like Obstructor and you get so much as a whiff of the poison, then you are going to die. It is a terrible idea to actually run this in bosses. So how would we change this from its maximized position to deal damage to have a tiny bit more survivability and or range if you prefer it? I personally don't see the appeal in having range on a boss battle bunny, because with high voltage up, it's 9 meters, and I don't really think it's that big of a deal to run within 9 meters of an enemy. But for those that want it, we'll talk about what mods you can take off. If you had to take away just one mod for the sake of HP or range, whichever you prefer, it'd be best to replace Spear and Shield, so that way you'll still reach the 40 million range for total damage within a speed of light cast. If you take away the electric power ratio, that would take away like half your damage. Like, it's not even funny. Don't do that. Taking away singular spec would be even better than that. Alternatively, you can take away mentality, but you'd still fall short of the 40 million total damage range, but you would maintain a roughly 1.7 million DPS, which would be the best DPS option, not the best total damage option, compared to the fully maximized build, while still allowing you to slot for HP. If you had to take off one more mod, because say you want HP or range or both, then the next mod to take off would be Strong Mentality. You're obviously going to be missing a lot of total damage in this manner, but if you must have an optimized bunny that can at least withstand a sneeze from any of the colossi, that would be it. On the fully optimized damage build, I do want to mention Slayer real quick, because Slayer does increase your total DPS. However, in terms of total damage, Slayer is actually a total damage loss. That is because Slayer not only increases your base skill power ratio, which is always good, but it also increases the cost of your skills. So right now we're resting at a 35.6% skill cost reduction, but it could be a 50.6% skill cost reduction if we don't have Slayer in effect. So right here you'll see that my general average DPS is around 1.67 million, with our total damage resting at 44.6 million. But if I change our skill cost to the negative 50.6 that it would be, as well as change the base skill power boost ratio to the 8.1% that Spear and Shield gives, I get about 3 million more total damage, but my DPS does drop to 1.35 million. We also get about 8 more seconds of runtime, if I'm not mistaken. Slayer is much better for burst, but in terms of sprint time and just overall total damage per speed of light cast, it would actually be best to take it off. Now, what you replace it with is kind of up in the air. The set that you get from Executioner is genuine ass. It's some of the worst shit I've ever seen. Best in slot would actually be the Battle Aesthetic set. That would net the highest total damage period that you could get. But not every fight is going to be about total damage. Sometimes you want higher burst, and Slayer is a much better fit. Only thing left to talk about now before moving on to the dungeon and farming builds is the Reactor. You would want an Electric Singularity Reactor, and as for your sub-rolls, you would obviously want damage against Colossus. As for the second roll, it's pretty much the same as Lepic. You can go for crit rate or crit damage. They're both going to be fantastic options. Crit rate technically pulls ahead of crit damage just by a tiny bit this time, but as usual, boosting the singular power ratio is going to be the best total damage increase. If I had to say though, which one was my preference, it would be crit rate, just for better consistency. You're going to be shooting your electricity a lot of times as you spin around whatever these bosses are. Being able to crit more reliably while the boss is down is going to drastically speed up the fight. And on the note of crit rate, you can use Blue Beetle as your reactor weapon. Blue Beetle, when you use a fusion skill, which is her Q, or her 1, or her first ability, whichever you prefer, has a 100% chance to grant a 30% increase in crit rate. The only problem with that is that 30% is not additive, so it's not going to take our crit rate of 30.77% and add another 30, else that would be an outrageous gun to use. The 30 is against our base crit rate of 15%, so it would add 4.5% crit rate to our damage. Now, that is an extremely strong buff, but it's typically not going to be make or break, and unless you have Blue Beetle fully built out with all of its copies, recall that you are also going to take a 20% skill cost negative, increasing the cost of your skills if you end up using it. Blue Beetle is nice. It's really just like a sprinkle on top, you know, but do not ever trust other people when they say that you have to build Blue Beetle for Boss Bunny, because that is fucking dumb. Now on to the dungeon build. I say dungeon specifically because this is meant for general activities and running through dungeons, and especially with the change that we just got in this update that removes all the occupation and all the super long objectives from hard mode dungeons. This means that with this bunny, you're going to be completing dungeons in 5 minutes or less. I won't dwell too long on this because we've all seen Dungeon Bunny do its thing, fucking wreck shit. But as for what we would do, honestly, we'd keep things mostly the same as the boss build. We still want to build for skill cost. The reason for which is there are plenty of dungeons where you have super long stretches with just not a whole lot of enemies, and if you get unlucky with MP Collector, then you're going to run out of mana, and on Bunny, if you aren't running, then everything feels like death. So we're going to keep Maximize Conservation in there at the least. As for mods that you would replace, Strong Mentality is obviously an option, Spear and Shield is another option. If you want to fit in range and health there, that's fine. If you had to pick one more thing to slot range in, if you want to run both range mods, which you should, then I would get rid of Singular Specialist while keeping Electric Specialist, and then replace Dangerous Ambush with MP Collector. You can still run High Voltage as your augment and whatever sub-attack module as you'd like, and you will kill most enemies before you even see them, while still doing outrageous amounts of damage to dungeon mobs and being able to maintain speed of light. And as long as you're maintaining speed of light, you're pretty much never going to get hit, so that's why I say health is pretty much optional. Adjust as you prefer. And then lastly, the farming build. I say farming because this is used in very specific cases. One good example would be the bunny cave. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, on Fallen Ark in the Fortress Zone, we have a cave with an electric pillar. If somehow you haven't heard of this, which would be amazing if you hadn't up until now. Bunny, with her third ability, is able to stand in one single spot in the cave, and as long as she has max range and is jumping, this build allows her to literally kill everything without having to move. It is fantastic to do while you're watching a show, if you just want to level some weapons or level your bunny while you're applying catalysts and you have to re-level her after this update for different slots that you're after. This is a great place to go. But it's also not just for this. You can also use it at like the block hypermining, anywhere where you're able to stand in one spot and jump and all the enemies will spawn in range. This is something that you can use for that specific case. It doesn't have to be these two places that I've mentioned. Now this build is pretty rigid in what you need on it. You need all 4 crit mods as you would normally, and then you need both range mods, and then you need nimble fingers and focus on electric. This will help meet our cooldown reduction requirement in order to renew the skill whenever we need it. I personally put in technician for more skill power mod just because that was what I had available. That slot is flex. You can put in whatever the fuck you want there. But lastly, we do need to have Potent Collector. Potent Collector is like MP Collector, except it allows you to recover custom resource at a chance whenever you kill something. Because of this, this means that as Bunny, you no longer need to run around at speed of light in order to build your bar back up. Your bar will constantly be built back up by killing enemies. And because of that, you no longer have to worry about the cost of maintaining your third ability, and you can just jump. That's all you have to do. That and press your third ability every once in a while. But it is the laziest approach to Bunny that I could possibly imagine. But again, as always, I have made this tool publicly available. I am just going to go ahead and publish the calculator for now. The visuals for it are not going to be what I want. I'm still not certain how I want to do the first Descendant section of my site just yet. But as for getting a calculator out there, because say you don't want my build, say you have a specific build you want for your very specific scenario and you want to optimize it, you can use this calculator to do that. You can weigh in different mod options, different reactor options, and you can see which is actually best for you. You don't have to follow this strictly. You can use this calculator to go dab on your friends or other YouTubers, prove them wrong, shit like that. As much as I fucking hate other content creators, the goal is not to shit on them, primarily, at least. That is a bonus. The goal is to inform you guys and help you better understand your own builds, or make them if you want.